Right, I think the rate of arrivals has slowed down enough that we can get started. Now, I'm going to do something. Now, if you've been, participating in these things over the course of the year, coming to workshops of mine or meetups, I'm going to do something that might surprise you. For the rest of you, it might not seem so surprising. I'm actually going to use a slide deck today. I spent most of the last few months. Yeah, no, Tom's throwing up his hands in horror. I've not been using slides. I've worked mostly in gallery mode, where we can all see each other, talk to each other, where we're working in collaboration tools, we're using chat or whatever it might be to do our work. But I am now going to share my screen and stick the deck on. And for the moment, I'm also going to mute you all as well. So this, as you'll probably realize, is for the sake of the recording. A couple of things to mention, to notice. Many of the slides have a URL at the bottom, and you'll be able to look those up, either in real time if you really want to, or afterwards. I will send an email after the webinar with all the links on. And there'll be a follow-up email sometime afterwards once I've got the recording onto, appropriately edited and onto YouTube and everything else. So everything will be nicely in the one place for you. So to introduce myself first, so I'm Mike Burrows. Some of you will know me through my books. So the first one, Kanban from the Inside, that was published in 2014. And bit of a lean agile classic, you could say now. It's mentioned in Wikipedia, which I think must make it must qualify. And it's sold a decent number of copies as well. It's been a sort of classic book for certainly the Kanban field. I think more widely as well. And it's the book in which I expanded on Kanban's values model, which I first originated in a New Year's blog post, New Year of 2013. Introducing Kanban through its values. And that blog post, I didn't know at the time, but was kind of going to change my career. The blog post led to a book, and one book has led to another. You can think of the Agenda Shift book as being taking the bullet points of the end of the Kanban from the Inside book, the assessment tool that flowed eventually out from that, and then all the workshop stuff that we've done around that, de-emphasizing the practice side of things. So there's not much sort of Kanban specific there at all, and much more emphasizing the conversations that we need to have with organizations when we're trying to encourage change to happen. And what we've realized in the last year or two is that we've created something that fits very well with what is called dialogic organization development, or generative organization development, and really moving away from that model where the expert knows best, the expert diagnoses, tells you what's wrong with your organization and prescribes some fixes to it. And then there's the really dysfunctional version of that diagnostic model where you don't bother doing the diagnosis, you just sell a solution. So you sell a framework, for example, and the change program becomes a rollout project. And that to me just fills me with horror. But it's not enough just to complain about what to me seems a dysfunctional behavior. And instead you need to offer, I felt I needed to offer some credible, practical, well-tested alternative. And that's what Agenda Shift is doing. It is bringing together, packaging up a very teachable, repeatable process for encouraging those kinds of conversations in organizations and helping them lead them through a process of change. And we now describe it as an engagement model. And what we're trying to do is distinguish it from the sort of conventional sort of managed change approach of the rollout project. So that was Agenda Shift. That was published first on LeanPub in 2017, and then published sort of properly. You can get it on Kindle and everything else, 2018. 2019, I published Right to Left. So all the, I said I didn't want to talk about practice and Agenda Shift in the Agenda Shift book. So everything I wanted to say about Lean Agile from a practice point of view, and from a frameworks point of view, and the specifics of organization that go with Lean and Agile, my plan was to put that in a separate book, and Right to Left is that book. And when I say right to left, that's a very firm stance of outcome orientation. So always looking at the frameworks, the tools, the practices, leadership, organization design, all those things from the point of view of outcomes, needs being met. And my definition of done is someone's need was met. And we work backwards from that. So right to left. So that's the books and myself. So the main topic of today is obstacles. And, when I started talking about obstacles, a few people reminded me of Marcus Aurelius. Now, I have to admit, I've not read Marcus Aurelius, but he is credited with having had a major impact on on Western thought over the last 2,000 years. Basically, he was the last of the good Roman emperors, we're told. What he's famous for now is his writing, which is the basis of Stoicism. So if you hear people talking about being people stoical, and so on, the body of knowledge that is based on is a lot of it is based on his writings. So the saying that people were reminded of is, what stands in the way becomes the way. And there's a longer quote here, but the basic idea is that when you are faced with an obstacle, or when you focus on an obstacle, that kind of concentrates your thought, and it changes the way you think. And your plan to get around the obstacle or over the obstacle or through it kind of defines your approach. And it makes it very important to choose the right obstacles. And this is really true in the in the change and transformation world as well. And this is something that we found in Agenda Shift. We noticed in our workshops, and you'll see in a minute how this fits into the framework, that we would have obstacles that kind of sounded plausible, but they weren't capable of supporting a productive conversation. And that for me was a problem. And we began to detect the smell of them, but to turn that into something teachable where we could help people recognize what were obstacles that were more or less helpful took us actually quite a bit of time. This is work that really has been done in the last year and a half or so, particularly based on some workshops I did in Berlin at the Leanovate offices. And choosing your obstacles really carefully is really important. If you choose the right obstacles, they will lead you to the right kind of outcomes. If you focus on the wrong obstacle, it will just you'll solve that obstacle or get past that obstacle, and you haven't actually got any quite closer to your overall objective. So it's very wasteful to choose the wrong ones. And also, choosing the right obstacle tends to lead to better solutions. How you frame the obstacle has an effect on what you bring in scope for your solution ideas. And so that's both of those aspects are going to be quite important to the webinar today. So to put that into Agenda Shift. So what is Agenda Shift? It's the wholehearted, outcome-oriented engagement model. So we'll start with engagement model. I mentioned the term already, and it's the category that Agenda Shift is in, and we are putting ourselves in a category that is outside of managed change. In fact, the whole idea of change management worries us quite a bit. Outcome-oriented, everything is focused on outcomes. Most of the concepts in Agenda Shift are an outcome, or at most one removed from it. And when I say an outcome, I mean everything from the most aspiration of goals down to the impact of a small experiment. So they work at a wide range of detail. And we organize them, develop them, create hypotheses, experiments around them, and so on. So that is the whole engine really of Agenda Shift. And it splits kind of into two parts, but they overlap, they intersect. So on the left, we've got ideal, obstacles, and outcomes, the I-do pattern. And you're going to get a glimpse at least of that today. On the right, we've got right to left strategy deployment. So that's how do we put this stuff actually into practice? How do we action these things? How do we sustain that that process of change and transformation? And between the two, an agenda for change. So something that makes it clear to everybody what it is, and this is a shared thing, something that we work on together. What are we trying to achieve? What's the purpose of all of this? What are the outcomes that we are focused on? organize them using mapping tools, for example, see the relationships between things, build what change people call as a theory of change, how one outcome supports another, how one outcome leads to another. And it gives us a really nice crossover into strategy as well. And in the last couple of years, we've done a lot of focus on strategy, going beyond pure transformation stuff and thinking more generally about using agenda shift as a strategy tool. The key pattern there, I've mentioned already, the I-do pattern: ideal, obstacles, outcomes. And we see this a lot in agenda shift. The first two main sort of sessions of agenda shift both use the I-do pattern. So when we're doing discovery, we're painting a picture of where we'd like to get to, the obstacles that are in the way of that, and then the outcomes that we can get to when we start to overcome those obstacles. When we're doing exploration, diving down into the detail using the assessment tool or some of our strategy review questions, the same idea applies. So for a particular issue, what does the ideal best look like? What obstacles are in the way of that? What outcomes are behind that? And in this very simple structure, little framework, generative pattern, you can plug in all sorts of tools. So tools that stimulate the imagination for the ideal part, various coaching tools, things like challenge mapping is a great way to explore the relationship between the ideal and the obstacles. So challenge mapping, why is that important? What stops that? Just with 2 questions, applied iteratively. Going from obstacles to outcomes. And what I think agenda shift is famous for is the clean language stuff, the 15-minute photo game. Agenda shift has become like the gateway drug to clean language for a number of people. But we're using that to model really the whole landscape of obstacles and outcomes in the context of that ideal. The miracle question from solutions focus, another framework that fits very well with this I-do pattern. So I kind of see obstacles right in the middle of that. Choose the wrong obstacles and the process isn't going to work so well. So we understand now how to detect good and bad obstacles, and the good obstacles, the ones most likely to result in a productive conversation. So I want you to reflect just for a moment. We're going to do a breakout in a minute, and then the normal breakout would be a series of breakouts on things like painting a picture of your ideal. What obstacles are in the way of that? Now we're going to do a different exercise today. Before we do that different exercise, I want you to think about what your obstacles might be. So we need to put that into some context. So I'll use a bit of technical jargon here. So for your adaptive challenge, for a significant challenge that you face, your organization faces, one that's going to require some significant learning, significant adaptation, and so on. Just think for a moment about what your ideal best would look like. What would good look like if you made real good progress on your adaptive challenge? I'll just give you a few moments to think about that. And then really directly, what stops that? What gets in the way? What stops that? What gets in the way? And what I'm going to ask you to do is to compose but not send a bullet point description of that obstacle, a bullet point summary of that obstacle. 5 or 6 words at most should be all you need. Compose that in chat, but don't hit return. I will count slowly to 20. And when we're all ready with our obstacles, we'll stick them in chat and see what, just see, are there some themes, some flavors that we see. And we'll compare those with I've pre-prepared a list of some favorite ones that I've seen over the years. And we'll see how many of those we see. So compose, but don't hit send yet. 5 or 6 words. And I will count to 20. 10. 5. Right, go. Hit send. Let's see some So we're seeing a nice flurry of obstacles coming through. Now, it's interesting that some of those obstacles actually sound like good things. Self-determination to me sounds like a good thing, not an obstacle. Perhaps there's an implied lack of there. We've got, let's look at a few. So want for autonomy. People have to agree to a common goal. Internal processes that hinder the positive outcome. Finance department. Change management to align to purpose. So that's something dear to my heart. Lack of transparency across teams. Hard to let go of the past. High stress level of members about COVID-19 and future. That's just a sample. I will now share a list of obstacles. These are the kind that I've commonly see in my workshops. So the first one here, I saw this one in the very first agenda shift workshop I did. I haven't checked the date. It's 2015, 2016, that sort of time frame. Lack of a knowledge management system. Next one might be dear to those Kanban people here. Lack of work in progress limits or WIP limits. Lack of people, lack of money, lack of time, poor quality, management or leadership or lack thereof. We had one of those in the chat just now. Culture and lack of some mindset or other, some named mindset or other. There's a lack of the agile mindset, for example. So these are all examples that I've seen in workshops in the last few years. Now, what I'm going to do now is send you out to your breakout rooms. And I'm going to ask you just to reflect on, first of all, do you recognize obstacles like this? Do you hear obstacles spoken in your workplaces from time to time? And do you think they're good or bad obstacles? And by good or bad, I mean, are these the good starting points for a conversation? So what I'm going to do is if I can get Zoom. Breakout rooms. I'm going to stick you into rooms of 5 or so people. I've actually lost track of how many people we have now. We have 45 people. So that's 9 breakout rooms. So just consider whether you think these are outcomes that obstacles, sorry, that you recognize, and whether they are good or bad from the point of view of whether you think these are good places for a productive conversation. I will send you out for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, you will see a warning with a 1-minute warning. You can ignore that warning. You'll get an extra grace minute at the end. So I'll have 6 minutes in total. So you'll get the warning after 5 and a 1 minute, and then we'll all come back together and we'll debrief that little breakout. So I will see you in a few minutes if I can find my mouse. Now you might have a button you need to press to go, but the invitation has gone. Good. So before we go back to the slide deck, let's see a bit of feedback from that exercise. So just some thoughts in terms of how well you recognize those obstacles, how you respond to them, whether you think they're useful or not useful, likely to start the basis of a good conversation, and so on. So who'd like to have a quick go at that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we all recognise them, and I think we all agreed that they were probably bad, and that when you have I think it was Assad said, just the word lack is a really helpful trigger to say this is probably a bad obstacle, because what you're doing is assuming a solution is the answer to your problem.
Yes. So that's about where I was 2 years ago. And I knew that lack of was a bad smell. I think even in my first book I mentioned, I think I described lack of as a sign of lazy thinking, which is perhaps a bit harsh. But it is certainly a bad smell. And what we'll do in a moment is kind of see it actually takes some very different forms, and understanding what those different forms are and why they're unhelpful is actually helpful in itself. Anyone else? We'll do one more.
We like the bad smell thing yes, completely. We felt like poor quality is quite accusatory. It places the blame on the people who are doing the work and ignores the system that they're embedded in. So in essence, the quality problem could be entirely down to poor specification. So yeah, the spec's poor, so the quality is poor, but actually it's the problem of the developers for not somehow being telepathic. And so effectively what it says is it's your fault, creates a negative emotional response, and then gives them absolutely no power to resolve the situation as well. So I think it's a triple whammy.
Yeah, it is a difficult one, and we will we'll expand on that one in a moment. It's actually one of the ones that causes us the most difficulty in actually articulating both what's wrong with it and what to do about it. We've got some constructive ideas now for dealing with those most difficult ones. So move on. So let's think about what we need from a good obstacle, first of all. Very briefly, we need them to be real, relevant, and representative. And if they're not real, then we are wasting a lot of energy by focusing on them, clearly. They need to be relevant. I beg your pardon? Oh, I haven't shared my screen. That's a bit of a schoolboy error. Let's...
If you're not used to working with slides.
I know, exactly. Yes, I love working without slides. I spent years, in workshops, in rooms with, PowerPoint on the screen behind me, and it worked fine. You can have a conversation with people, but it really does get in the way when you're doing things online, I've found. But it's a bit more necessary today. So it is, every time I click to bring in focus, it advances the slides. Right, so good obstacles, real, relevant, and representative. So if they're not real or relevant, then we're going to waste a lot of energy looking at them. If they're not representative, then we're not likely to form a good strategy overall. So, typically we're talking about multiple obstacles and making sure that they are representative of the set of challenges that we face. But there's another kind of useful meaning of the word representative that we'll come to later. Representative from a people point of view. Do these represent the views of different people, represent the perspectives of different people? And that turns out to be quite helpful, especially from the point of view of the first of the things to avoid, alienating people needlessly, and secondly, constraining options prematurely. So we'll look now at the traps, and these are very common traps. I see this all the time. I'd be surprised if I've ever had a workshop where most of these traps haven't been fallen into by one person or another, or one group or another at some point. So you've picked up already on the lack of language. There's various, it might not be lack of, it might be poor or not enough or something like that. So I summarize that with scarcity language, but it's very obvious with lack of this, lack of that. And there are three very interesting, very different categories. So the first category is language that sells a solution or a theory. And we'll have examples of both of those in that list. Lack of a knowledge management system, as I mentioned, came up in my very first Agenda Shift workshop. And I'd already written about lack of in the Kanban from the Inside book. So you already knew I was onto something with this. Next is language that could be perceived as judgmental. So when you're starting to hear lack of commitment, lack of whatever, and it's very clearly describing people's attitude, faced with that as an obstacle, the barriers are likely to go up, and that is a problem in itself. Just admitting people back. And the last one, and this is the most difficult category, language that identifies only one side of an imbalance. And that's probably best explained by example. These are the trickiest ones. But when we look at, when we represent an imbalance with just the lack of, we are closing off half of the space, maybe 2/3 of the space. You know, there's another side to that imbalance. And there's also the mechanisms that try to maintain balance as well. And we're ignoring 2 out of those 3 if we focus only on the thing that we are lacking. Next group is what I would call tribal shorthand. So anywhere there is jargon. Jargon isn't always wrong, but often I found when you see jargon in an obstacle, that obstacle actually fails to identify what the real issue is. So that's why that one's important. Another one is finger pointing. We had an example, you know, management. It was in my examples. I think there was an example in chat today. You know, just saying, you know, the problem is that particular group. I had an example in Athens last year or the year before, and I was told the obstacle was change management. And that's quite an ambiguous term. I didn't know what they meant by it. I thought perhaps they were referring to the whole sort of practice of change management, but you know, I asked what kind of change management, and they pointed at the group. You know, those people, they get in the way. They're an obstacle. And if you need to enlist their help in finding the solution, that's going to be a problem. And kind of related to that, to language that in more subtle ways identifies in groups and out groups. So are you part of the tribe or not, when in your choice of language? And the last one I call begging the objective, and that's a funny phrase. But there are some obstacles that are so big that effectively they identify the whole challenge that you are facing. You know, when you've overcome the obstacle, well, you've done it. You know? So as a starting point, it's not very helpful. And again, probably best explained through example. So let's go through our list. So we had lack of a knowledge management system, lack of work in progress limits, lack of people or money or time, poor quality, management or leadership or the lack thereof, culture, and lack of the X mindset. Now, you just think about the previous slide, you begin to think about how these might work. So lack of a knowledge management system. So very obviously scarcity language, we've got that lack of, and it's language that's selling a solution. And this obstacle, when raised at my first agenda shift workshop, just fell completely flat. No one was interested. You know, the sense I got was that person had come to the workshop wanting to sell this solution, regardless of what the rest of the conversation was going to be about. And his colleagues were ready for it and were going to ignore it. And it just didn't advance the conversation one bit. And also, there's the jargon bit as well. You know, so the jargon is a sign that whatever the obstacle is has failed completely to identify what the issue is. Next one, lack of work in progress limits. So again, we got some jargon. Now it's jargon, depending on your point of view, is selling either a solution or a theory or both. Now, you might be trying to sell Little's Law and queuing theory, and say that the problem that we have in our teams is that our work in progress is out of control, our teams are overburdened, we need to control that. And the way you control that is with work in progress limits. Now, work in progress limits are one tool you can use to achieve all of that. So it's a solution. But there are multiple solutions. So by identifying only one solution, you are closing off all the others. And you might be trying to sell that solution on the basis of a theory that other people don't yet accept. And it's actually a very difficult one to sell until people really get it. So until they've experienced it, seen what an intervention around work in progress actually feels like. This is why we play, games like Feature Ban and Change Ban, because people get a sense of what they feel like. So I think this is not a great basis for the beginning of a conversation. Lack of people or money or time. Now I'm going back to my time as a manager. So I ran a global department at an investment bank, back in the day. And I remember when I first got to the point of being a manager of managers, and I would have people come to me saying, "Mike, I need to hire more people." And I would say that came as a surprise to me. So why do you need to hire more people? Well, we've got all this work in the backlog. and there's no way we're going to get through it with the size of team that we've got. But most of those things in the backlog weren't things that anyone had actually committed to. And we had to make sure they understood how I saw their role as framed was, how do we achieve the best possible outcomes for our customers, given, what we've already agreed is a sensible amount of money to spend on development and whatever else that we did. There's a balancing thing going on. What's the outputs and the outcomes that we want relative to the investment and the size of team and so on. It is so much more productive to reframe that kind of lack of as an imbalance. You've got so many angles of attack. It might be right to grow the team, or it might be right to have some conversations about, well, what actually is important? What are we trying to focus on? What are we trying to deliver? And we can focus on what are the mechanisms that keep those two things in balance with each other. So lots of lines of attack there. So where you have an imbalance, make sure that you expose the imbalance, not just the scarcity. Poor quality. Now, this is another one we've struggled with. I have to be honest with you, we struggled with this one for a while. And it was one of our community Zoom calls where we thrashed this one out. And Andreas Fittler, who I don't know if he's on this Zoom, but known to some of you here, had the inspiration to describe it as an imbalance. So when someone says there is poor quality, what is actually going on is that quality isn't meeting somebody's expectation. And now the question is that expectation reasonable or not? As well as, is things of a quality that's good enough and so on. We've got multiple lines of attack there. And there's the balancing mechanisms as well. How do we maintain expectations and what we actually produce in accord with each other? So that was really, really helpful. And it depends on context whether you should focus on the quality capability of the team, of the development process, or focus on the, how do we manage expectations? Have we even had the conversation about what is reasonable? Are we looking for perfection where perfection is impossible given our other constraints, and so on and so on. So choose which side of the imbalance to focus on, and if you don't know what side to choose on, frame it as an imbalance, and that's something you can work with later. So the next one, now we're starting to get into more finger pointing now. So again, it's a tribal shorthand. The Agile community loves to hate on managers, and management is the problem. Management certainly can be part of the problem, but it's not the beginning of a constructive conversation if that's where you're going to start. Certainly, if it's the behavior of managers that you want to change. So much more helpful to focus on what's going on in your team, what's going on in your process, that is the result of an unproductive behavior from management. And that's something you can have a sensible conversation about in a way that a finger pointing type of conversation doesn't achieve. That's that one. Culture. So you get this on the news sometimes. You hear some failing at some big institution, some government department, an agency, or whatever it might be, and somebody will say it's a cultural problem. But that is just restating the overall problem. It's not actually homing in on what really went wrong and why it went wrong. It's a very broad brush kind of statement. So for something like an agile transformation, to say that our obstacle is culture is kind of, well, that's just restating what it is we're trying to achieve. We're trying to go from the culture that we have now to one that is more agile. It's not a useful starting point for productive conversation about where to focus our efforts. And that saves till last the best. Lack of the X mindset, lack of the agile mindset. So it is scarcity language. You've got the lack of. It's selling a solution or a theory. You know, if we could reprogram everybody to have an agile mindset, we'd be sorted. It's selling a theory. The whole mindset thing is a theory that not everybody buys. It can be perceived as judgmental. You know, you haven't got the right mindset. Now, that's a tough message to receive. Tribal shorthand, so whatever the X is a bit of jargon. The mindset on its own is a bit of jargon. It defines in groups and out groups, those that have it and those that don't. And it begs the objective. If your goal is an agile transformation and your obstacle is lack of the agile mindset, well, you've kind of just redefined your transformation as a whole. So not very helpful. So you understand how these different traps work. So let's think about how we might improve some of those obstacles. So lack of a knowledge management system, you know, the important thing is to identify what is a real obstacle that people in this organization face on a regular basis today. And it might be something like knowledge is hard to access. Now that's a little bit bland, but it's, you know, that's, and we could make it more specific in an organizational context. But there may be other issues. It might be about the dissemination of intelligence, for example, rather than, you know, accessing knowledge. So focus on a real and relevant issue that most people would recognize. Lack of work in progress limits. You know, the real issue for the team, you know, the reason why they're struggling, the reason why they're suffering, the reason why they're not able to deliver in the way that they want to is that their workload exceeds capacity. You know, they are thrashing, context switching. There's all the technical problems associated with systems overburdened. There's all the psychological human impact of people and teams being overburdened and so on. To focus on those. Work in progress limits are a solution to address the issue. If you've got people bought into the issue, you've got people motivated now to find an appropriate solution, one that will work for the teams and the people involved in it. So lack of people or money or time, I would focus on, you know, like, as I mentioned before, on the mismatch, on the imbalance, on the mechanism for maintaining that balance. You know, a lot of this comes down to, you know, communication, stakeholder management, expectation management, all those kinds of things. It may genuinely be that the budget isn't big enough, but maybe what changes is the scope rather than the budget, you know, or the time frame rather than the scope, and so on. So lots of different ways of attacking this kind of problem. By identifying it as a lack of money or people or time, you're probably identifying the obstacle that is the least tractable, the one that's going to be hardest to solve. And then maybe other areas that are going to be much more open to a solution. So the last one, poor quality, that was a difficult one, or the last for this slide. Again, focus on the imbalance and the expectations bit. So something about our process or a product, the way it works, isn't aligned with expectations. Now, why is that? And which side of that imbalance do we want to attack? And it might be both of them, or the fact that we've allowed that gap of expectations to grow. You know, how did that happen? What's the cause of that? So that's the first few, reframed. Now for the harder ones, you know, the last three, I'm not going to give alternative solutions or alternative obstacles to each of those, but there are some lines of attack. So we've got management or lack thereof, culture, and lack of the X mindset. So you've got three main strategies. The first one is just to delete it. Now, if you've got a long list of obstacles, and the rest of them are real and relevant and representative, then you lose nothing and gain a lot by just deleting that particular obstacle. And that may well be your best solution. And if you've got a list of 10 obstacles, prioritizing it down to a list of 5 is probably a smart thing to do sensibly. And the ones that are, you know, have anything dodgy about them, have a bad smell about them, then those should be the first ones to delete. Now, it may make sense to explore around it a bit, to expand on it and so on. And this is where tools like challenge mapping come in really well. So, you know, why is that important? What stops that? You know, you're starting to get people engaged in the I do process. You know, why is that important is getting people towards an ideal. What stops that is surfacing more relevant obstacles. And with a few iterations of that, you might turn your big ugly obstacle into a one or more real and relevant and representative obstacles. And the last one is get the right people in the room. You know, if there is a smell of finger pointing in groups, out groups, all the rest of it about your obstacles, that you should probably take that as a sign that you didn't have the right people in the room in the first place. And I mention that now as a recommendation that you do get the right people in the room when you are going through this kind of process. In the Right to Left book, I developed what's called my rule of three. This has been knocking around in the sort of agenda shift space for a while. I hadn't actually written it up anywhere, so it went into the Right to Left book. But the rule of three is you want people in the room who are representative. They have skin in the game. You know, they're not just people who are there to pick holes in your thinking, and they represent at least 3 levels of seniority, if the concept of seniority means anything in your organization, and in most organizations it does. Now, with at least 3 levels, you get a much more real kind of conversation. You don't get senior people, you know, saying disparaging things about staff, or vice versa. You're allowing conversations to move quickly across multiple levels of organization. So you're speeding the flow of information around the organization and so on. And really, for any important feedback loop in your organization, it can be useful to look at whether we've got, you know, those 3 levels in there. But for a conversation about where we want to get to, what are our obstacles, what are our desired outcomes, and so on, that rule of 3 is really helpful, and you'll get better quality obstacles, and as a result, better quality outcomes if you do that. So those are the really tough ones. I'm going to just quickly share an advanced exercise. This is just something for you to ponder, and you will see in a moment why I mentioned this. So this is an advanced exercise. This one I normally do only in our deep dive workshops. And it's a exercise, it's kind of a combination of Edgar Schein's culture pyramid and systems thinking. And the idea is we got the Schein pyramid on the left. You may have seen this drawn as an iceberg. I can't draw, so I draw it as an underwater pyramid. But you've got at the top the things you can see, the artifacts. This is anthropology speak. The things you can see in the organization, things that you can point at. Things like tools, things like meetings, things like the working environment, certain things about behavior that manifest themselves, and so on. Underpinning those are the real values of the organization, not necessarily the ones that are on the poster on the wall, but the real values of the organization, and the base assumptions that people don't even think about as they operate with, or these are things that people have to learn as they join an organization, but soon it becomes so ingrained that people don't even think about. It's hard to remember that those assumptions are even there. So the exercise is quite a difficult one. That's why we keep it for the advanced workshop. And it's thinking about, where does that obstacle come from, and coming up with an explanation that is completely charitable. You know, it accepts that the obstacle was put in place, you know, with goodwill, you know, for the best motivations and so on. It worked out in a way that in the end seems unfortunate, but it was done with good reason. So what was the explanation for that? And then what are the values or base assumptions that drove the placement of that obstacle? And then you can ask what keeps it there as well. You know, and this is a bit more systems thinking. You know, why is the obstacle still there, you know, months or years down the line? So I'll illustrate this with an example. So a large organization where they are concerned about the speed of their innovation pipeline. And they highlighted an issue, and that is there is a cultural thing that we like to get everything right first time. We value right first time. And the base assumption is that it's expensive not to get things right first time. And the trouble is, it's very hard to experiment when you have to get it right first time. And so a value that served that organization very well, a quarter of a century ago, is now holding them back. They're not innovating fast enough. So that is a charitable, positive explanation. And what I'm trying to this is an exercise on the tin. It's an exercise in culture and systems thinking. What actually becomes is an exercise in empathy. And the real message of this exercise is that empathy is a superpower. If you can engage empathetically across organizational boundaries, or with people that you are supporting as a practitioner, as a consultant, a coach, and so on, it's so much easier to work out what's actually going on and to help people find their own solutions and so on. So that's the what were we thinking exercise, or the Shine exercise. The inspiration for it is Edgar Shine's book, Organizational Culture and Leadership, which is quite a chunky textbook, but one of the really best books in that space. Highly recommend that book. So moving on and just wrapping up now. So I mentioned that exercise because we actually do have a deep dive workshop coming up about a month from now, late November. And we're doing this, of course, online. What used to be a 2-day workshop is now 8 sessions of 2 hours each. So it's a good 16 hours. By the time we've joined early and perhaps had some conversation afterwards, well over 16 hours, more than 2 days worth of workshop across 8 sessions over 4 days. And they are they're aimed at the sort of Europe mainly, but open to APAC as well. We're doing them in the mornings, UK time. Time them, so that should be reasonably convenient for people in the UK and in mainland Europe. So check the events calendar and check out the deep dive workshop. So you'll have, I will do. Basic structure is 4 sessions on the I do stuff, so discovery and exploration. And then we'll have a session on mapping, and we have 3 different mapping exercises, and then the last few sessions are faced on the deployment stuff. So how do we manage our portfolios of experiments? What do good feedback loops look like, and so on. So that's coming up in November. Check out the events calendar. And I think it just left me now to wrap up. So if you remember, Marcus Aurelius, what stands in the way becomes the way, and just how important it is to choose the right obstacles. Putting obstacles into context as far as the agenda shift framework is concerned, and in particular, the ideal obstacles outcomes pattern. Then the traps, scarcity language, the lack ofs and so on, tribal shorthand, finger pointing, jargon, all that kind of stuff. And the big one, begging the objective, coming up with obstacles that sound very wise, but in fact, all they really are is just kind of a restatement of the problem and don't actually give you a way forward. The lesson of the deep dive exercise, empathy is a superpower. It's so much help you be a much better practitioner, a much better consultant, a much better coach, a much better manager with some empathy. So much easier to understand what's going on if you start on the basis of empathy. And lastly, practice. Keep an eye out for those obstacles that might want reframing. Check out things like the I do pattern and look at the coaching patterns that we employ to move easily between ideal obstacles and outcomes and so on. These are things that you can practice. Some of them you kind of need permission to try. If you're going to go very coachy on someone, you should make sure that that's expected. But some of these are things where you're just disciplining yourself to not to impose yourself in unhelpful ways. So that's the end of the hour. That's the end of the webinar formally. I will stop sharing the screen in a moment, and I'll be very happy to take a few questions. So we'll stay on potentially another 10 minutes or so. Those of you that need to go, thank you very much for joining. I hope you enjoyed this. You'll hear from me soon, once today and once as the video goes up on YouTube, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Mike, you had a question.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible. Yeah. You're not visible.
Yeah, so one second. Yeah, so supposing if I were to conduct, a retrospective with a team, and all these terms, when we are using the words like lack of, these kind of
Yeah.
terms, they come from the team. It's not actually as an agile, as a coach that we say, and then we use one of the liberating structures, and we actually even rank them blindedly, like nobody knows who is given how much points to each of those
Yeah.
obstacles which they have identified. And then we grade the obstacles which are like top three obstacles for the team. So what I'm learning from here right now is that using uh, the language pattern that you've shown right now, reword those obstacles and make them more specific by discussing with the team.
Yes.
Is
Plus
that
one thing. One thing I should mention. When I say reword them, reframe them, that is for them to do, not me. When people, when we're discussing an obstacle that we think might be unhelpful, I resist the temptation to reword it myself. In the end, it needs to be an obstacle that means something to them.
Yeah.
They need to be motivated to overcome it. So all I will do is put up, share these points, help them recognize what's unhelpful about it, help them understand what's going on with that obstacle, and encourage them to reframe it. It doesn't take long, a few minutes for even for a long list of obstacles is usually all that's needed.
Yeah. Thanks.
Mike, can I just in the iceberg picture?
Yes, the iceberg pyramid. Yes,
the iceberg pyramid thingy. The artifacts, are they things that you see as evidence, or are they actually a thing? So an artifact might be a fortnightly change review board.
It's all of it. I'm actually re-listening to the Edgar Schein book right at the moment, and it's in the early chapters of the book. This stuff, and it's all the kind of anything you can point at, anything you can notice, anything that you can take as evidence, even to the point of your own reactions to those things can even be evidence in itself. If you're surprised by something because it's not what you've seen elsewhere, that itself is something you can write down and note, and worry about what's going on there, and that might help lead you to an understanding of what's really going on.
So it could be like behaviors or what people talk about.
Yes.
Or
Yeah, I mean in the book it contrasts two very different organizations. So DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and Ciba-Geigy. So DEC had a culture. It's one I recognize. I worked in a software house that very similar culture where nothing was decided without a very, very robust discussion. I mean, basically an argument, and it could even be quite aggressive, absolutely tearing into the idea until, if the idea has passed the test of argument, then it's allowed to proceed. And now to Edgar Schein going into this organization, he was shocked at what seemed, at what he saw, what he first perceived as very high levels of aggression, until he understood what was actually going on and actually could see that people could still be, happy, pleasant colleagues outside of that violent discussion on a particular issue. Now, I worked in one organization where, a conversation could very easily descend into a flame war. The robust testing of an idea, they took very seriously, but occasionally it would get completely out of hand. They contrasted that with Ciba-Geigy, where the values there were much more around experience, seniority, kind of. The culture seemed a bit more like an academic institution. You sort of rose through the ranks until you'd be a senior director, would be like becoming a professor in the university. And for one person to suggest something to somebody else was almost an affront. It was a suggestion that you don't know your field well enough. So the almost exact opposite to the DEC case. And in both cases, these examples examples are so extreme that Shine's own reaction to those cultures was actually part of, he treated those as artifacts in his studies of them, and was able to talk through them with the people he was working with in those organizations. So yeah, first of all, it's the stuff you experience and you see and observe and write down and all the rest of it, and then going deeper into why that might be. So values and base assumptions. Yeah.
So would the...
I mean, that picture is very well known. It's a very popular slide.
Right.
It's well worth. I honestly recommend the book, Organizational Culture and Leadership by Edgar Schein. It is a great book if you want to read a really good book from one of the greats of organization development.
So just quickly going on from would a reasonable question, when somebody says we need WIP limits, say, I'm just saying, is this a reasonable approach, or in your experience does it take you down a rabbit hole? Is something like, what have you seen or heard that suggests that we need WIP limits?
Yeah, we might do that. Yeah. So that works for many of those obstacles. I mean, what have you seen or heard that suggests that we need a knowledge management system? That can work. Yeah. What's happening what is happening when, I'm going to use a clean language version. What is happening when we need a knowledge management system? Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, Mike. I have a quick question. So see that when you're broaching one of these subjects, and you want to try and bring about some of that kind of change, or you're trying to make an improvement. You're obviously, do you find that doing it in a sort of smaller stepwise, experimental way works? People obviously are used to doing that with product, but doing it on a kind of process level or an organizational design level. So I'm just wondering, with product, there's obviously there's a lot of material around how to manage your experiments in a structured way. Do you think that kind of management of experiments and that visibility or explicit management of those experiments at an organizational level
it is very explicit. I mean, that is the right to left strategy deployment piece is kind of lean startup for organization design. I mean, I was working with people, going back. This is going back most of 10 years. People like Jeff Anderson, for example, he wrote a little book, Lean Change Management. There's Jason Little, same sort of space. I've been, agenda shift starts a bit sooner than that. We are starting with those conversations the organization needs to have with itself, before we're getting into too deeply into the experimentation mode or feeding that experimentation mode. But that experimentation thing is very important. There's no doubt about it. And what's very interesting is that all those tools, there's been massive crossover between the organization world and the product world for decades. The product world now is using tools that Deming would have recognized 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. What we can thank the product people for doing is putting their magic product sprinkly dust over everything and making things more acceptable, more inviting, more fun to use. But fundamentally, many of those same ideas are there. But I would say there's a caveat, and it's one of my more provocative blog posts recently. I don't teach PDCA, the classic experiment cycle, because it's actually very hard to sustain. If you don't have the right integration between your experiment cycle, not a term I like to use, but while we're talking about PDCA, and things that are more about purpose and strategy and all the rest of it, then it tends to die a death very, very quickly. I've been personally close to continuous improvement initiatives that have lasted a single-digit number of weeks, and it's just embarrassing. And getting to the bottom of why that is, I think is really important. So the last couple of chapters of Agenda Shift aren't just about the practice of framing experiments and conducting them. They're also about sort of serious questions of organization design. How do you integrate this stuff, sustain this stuff, and so on. The short answer to the question is yes, but there are a whole load of issues. I think the Agile community and and the lean community as well, I think are rather underplayed just how difficult some of this stuff is. I mean, we all must have come across, Scrum teams that stopped doing their retrospectives, for example. Why is that? And one answer is, well, the retrospectives aren't fun enough. Perhaps they're not meaningful enough. Perhaps they're not sufficiently integrated.
Yeah, I think I think the last point, I think, is probably has a lot of weight to it. That it's people don't see the result of the work that they put into it. They don't see it's quite a different kind of work. So people are probably a bit wary about it anyway from what they're normally doing. They're a bit cautious around it, and so they really want to see the value or feedback from what they put into it.
Yes.
And
yes.
it typically, sort of paradoxically, it's harder to see the feedback from that kind of work sometimes than just get head down and just get on with what you were doing. So
yes.
I think that's what sometimes causes those efforts to die a death, is that people don't feel a sense of.
That's why you're right. This stuff needs to be made explicit. And there needs to be a moment where we reflect on what we've changed and what the result of that change and what we learned through making that change and so on. All the things that we would do if we were doing a hypothesis-driven product development, we need to do for our organizational changes as well. Without that reflection, then you're not really learning. Yeah. Maybe one more, then we'll.
May I have a question?
Yep.
So I'm really fascinated with the model and with the approach you're describing. So my question is, how well does it translate across cultures and across languages? So my team isn't English native, and I don't think your book is available in Ukrainian yet. So what?
The book isn't. A number of our tools have been translated. So many of the individual tools have been, they're Creative Commons, and people have contributed translations to them. The assessment tool is available in 7, 8 languages, maybe more now, and certainly the facility is there to translate it. And it is used. It is used around the world. I think the heavy outside the UK and the US, probably the heaviest use is in Scandinavia. So a lot going on in Norway and Sweden in particular. And then I think there's another sort of bubble of interest in the German-speaking countries. Before lockdown, I was doing 2 workshops a year in Berlin, for example. And most of the tools have been translated into German. I don't have a good answer to how culturally significant it is, or culturally sensitive any of the tools are. I do have experience of working outside of the UK. If you've read Kanban from the Inside, you'll know that my case study was based in Hungary, and actually quite a different working culture to the working culture in the UK. People were much more likely to look to their managers to tell them what to do than was the case in the UK. Coming from an investment bank, which is a very competitive environment, it was quite a change for me. And I had to work quite hard in terms of creating the space in which people would come up with ideas of their own and would be happy to express them and so on, and sometimes deliberately encourage them to have meetings while I was out of the country. I've not tried agenda shift in Hungary. Or Lithuania, for that matter, but I think we have enough of a spread. The basic principles, we don't rely on particular models of development or psychology or maturity or anything like that. It is basically comes down to respecting the individual, respecting their creativity, respecting their agency, and helping them articulate what they want to achieve and what's stopping that, and then give them the tools to then help them frame the experiments, the probes, whatever you want to call them, that will move them forward. So we try to make as few assumptions as possible. That is very explicit in Agenda Shift. That's something we borrowed from the clean language community. Be very explicit about our assumptions. Don't make assumptions that we don't have to make. And that helps to minimize the sort of cognitive dissonance when you're working with people. So that's the best answer I can give at the moment. I mean, I'd love to be able to give a better answer, but that's a start. Yeah. Right, it's now 1:15. It probably is time to say goodbye, but thank you all of you that have stayed to the end. Thank you for participating, and I hope you enjoyed it. And watch out for those 2 emails.